Um, so what we're going to talk about today is fairy tales. And I know what some of you are thinking, fairy tales? I'm in college. We should be studying real literature. Let me assure you, fairy tales are real literature. And if you read and view everything in this unit, I think you'll have a new appreciation for this genre. We'll look at the origins of fairy tales, we'll look at modern rewrites and videos, we'll look at what contemporary scholars are saying about fairy tales and their values. So we're going to look at this from a lot of different angles, and you guys are going to have a lot of freedom on this essay. So I think it'll produce some really interesting results. But first, let's address a couple of the biggies. Let's start with the first one, right? The Brothers Grimm. Because if it's not Disney, sort of the other biggie that you're most familiar with, which we'll get to in a second, then it's usually Grimm. And there's, a really good reason for this. Grimm's fairy tales have been widely available for a long time. They're seen as, in some ways, one of the first collections, at least of Germanic fairy tales. Their collection, Children and Household Stories, was first published in 1812 and was originally intended for adults, which I always think is really interesting, that a lot of these tales were not meant for a child audience at first. The Grimm brothers had collected the Germanic tales in an effort to preserve the stories which had previously been passed down orally. Oral tradition, of course, had been going on for years and years and years, and this distinction between oral and written tradition is really difficult to establish, because upper class people would have heard these stories from peasants, polished them, and published them. And peasants would have heard about published stories, modified them, and passed them down orally. So where these stories started and which version you're getting, a little hard to tell in a lot of cases. And this distinction between fairy tales and folk tales is also a little confusing sometimes. Fairy tales dealt primarily with upper class people and extraordinary events, whereas folk tales relied more heavily on farm and village settings. But this is also a difficult distinction to make, and we're going to pretty much be using the term fairy tales in this course, even if something maybe fits more in the folktale category. And so Grimm's collection contains stories of both kinds, and stories that actually combine the two traditions, sort of adding to this difficulty. And while, of course, the Grimms claim to have gotten the stories exclusively from the German peasants and lower class, they also definitely got some from upper class women who heard the stories from peasants or lower class nannies, read them in magazines, that sort of thing. In fact, at least two of their sources have French backgrounds or connections, and were likely influenced to some degree by Perrault's tales, and we'll read some of Perrault as well. And Perrault's tales were also written from oral accounts with some of his own embellishments, and those were published in 1697, so quite a long ways before Grimm was published. The brothers addressed this in subsequent editions and took out the most obviously problematic tale in this case, which is Puss in Boots, although they left others in which bore a strong resemblance to Perrault's tales. So even from the very beginning of actually publishing fairy tales, there's been a weird, like, who owns these and who do these belong to, where are these originally from, that makes a really, really rich tradition, but also one that's really difficult to nail down in a lot of ways. And there's been tons of study into the origins of fairy tales, but that work is really difficult. The truth is often obscured because of the fact that so many cultures have versions of these stories, which we'll see in the tales we read. Beauty and the Beast is really interesting in this way because of so many cultures have really interesting versions of this tale. Cinderella is another one that we won't read, but that's really, really rich in cultural tradition. So in addition to it being hard to nail down the origins of these, lots and lots of theories and schools of interpretation have developed surrounding the origins, purposes, etc. of folk tales and fairy tales. We'll talk about a couple of these. If you're particularly interested in a certain school of thought, definitely jump on it. Like I said, you'll have lots of freedom with this essay, so outside sources are going to be fine. So if you're interested in one of these areas, definitely look into it for the essay. Anthropological and mythical interpreters consider the tales to be full of allusions to primitive rituals, especially initiation rites, as well as primitive explanations of natural occurrences, such as the change of seasons. And we can see this in some certain tales. Freud sees them, not surprisingly, as unconscious fantasies, much like those of our unconscious. Feminist theorists actually have a lot to say about fairy tales and see them Oftentimes they focus on the patterns of male domination and female subjugation, which I think is a really important idea, and I think it's important to look at the tales through a lens of gender. But I think some of the feminist theories are sort of undercut by the delightful worlds of rebellious daughters that we see in these tales. And these worlds are often more interesting and memorable than her father's power. And also we see a number of women who, defying their fathers, end up with the men they want, even if the men are poor. We see women saving men. And we see a number of clever, active, heroic women in the stories. Oftentimes, these are even older women who would have had even less of an audience in a lot of ways. So I think some of the feminist theories are interesting, but I think the gender lens can sort of go both ways. So further undermining this fact is, of course, that women are capable of identifying with men heroes, and men are capable of identifying with female heroes. So I think if you're interested in the gender lens, it's really rich, which we'll see in even the Little Red Riding Hood exercise that you guys are going to do this week. What we sometimes see as a tale about a weak girl is not always the case. So lots to talk about there. Marxist readings often focus on the political and social aspect of the tales. They argue that the tales introduce children to certain ideals of male-female relationships and responsibilities. And some people try to interpret and categorize them by their area of origin or by the characters and situations that show up. There's a lot of interesting material on that actually in the anthology that you have on fairy tales. And Bettelheim, whose work we'll read during this unit, sees fairy tales as addressing the way children see, adapt to, and interpret society. So he places less emphasis on the historical or cultural origins of tales, and he suggests that, among other things, the arbitrary power of kings and queens in the story often highlight the feelings that children have about their own bosses or parents. And the evil stepmother is seen as a stand-in for the cruel, angry, or rejecting side of the real mother, who can then be idealized as entirely good and loving in the person of the dead biological mother. And this interpretation, interestingly, is supported by the fact that Wilhelm Grimm changed the mothers in Snow White and Hansel and Gretel to stepmothers after the first edition. So Bettelheim also contends that the clear good versus evil in fairy tales appeals to children because they can't yet deal with that middle ground of uncertainties in the real world. So he has a lot to say about how fairy tales are really helpful to children and help them make sense of the world. So if you're interested in looking at that, how fairy tales help children, he's a really interesting one to look at, and we'll read some of his work in this unit. What some of these interpretations by all these different theorists might overlook is the pure imaginative quality of these fairy tales. While they're often rooted in real life, social, or moral context, these stories go past that into realms we don't get to experience day to day. The real world space of a village or farm opens up to reveal adventures or encounters with powerful beings like witches or giants or talking animals, or really interesting adventures and encounters with ordinary objects like combs or mirrors or hats that suddenly contain magical powers. And these enchanted places allow for an imaginative freedom not always possible in the worlds in which these fairy tales were written, or even in our own worlds. And there's really something to be said for that sort of imagination, and those exciting adventures and encounters. And while some have viewed these fairy tales as moral lessons on good behavior isn't always rewarded in a terribly healthy way in these tales. Oftentimes, good behavior is rewarded with wealth and power, which is not necessarily a quality goal that we want to pass down to our children. And many times, lying and cunning are handsomely rewarded in these tales. Other times, these tales seem to simply be satisfying some desire for sensational violence. So seeing these as moral tales can be interesting, and I think there are some morals in these tales, especially some of the tales, Perrault and the Grimms oftentimes add morals to the end. But these can be seen as sort of imaginative tales that you can get a lot of different messages from. And of course, there are also just a wide variety of stories that sort of defy characterization, that have conflicting goals: romantic love, enchantment, rescue, tall tales, animal fables, crime stories, which we'll see with Bluebeard, funny stories about really stupid people, which can be very amusing. There are also lots of ways to try and classify these stories, like we talked about, and that can be really useful and really interesting to look at. But I also want to encourage you to enjoy these stories for what they are. Now, just a brief couple of notes about contemporary fairy tales. The interest in these stories has really picked up in the last decade or so of contemporary literature. There are new anthologies of fairy tale rewrites, and even a literary journal called the Fairy Tale Review, dedicated to publishing stories and poems that interact with the fairy tale tradition. We'll look at some of these modern rewrites that do a really interesting job of capturing the meaning of the original and adding twists that make it more relatable and meaningful to an audience today. We'll also look at some of the contemporary scholars who are studying fairy tales in some really interesting ways right now, and talking about their sort of importance for our society. Another really interesting thing to remember: the older tales you'll read are closer to the originals than the Disney tales you might be most familiar with. Disney made a lot of changes, in part to make the tales more visual and palatable for kids. And one of the articles that you'll read talks about some of the problematic features of Disney versions. So if you're a lover or hater of Disney, it might be interesting to use that as a paper topic. Because remember, you'll have lots of freedom with this essay, and you can feel free to use outside sources. So in this unit, get ready to experience fairy tales in a whole new way. I cannot wait to see what types of amazing papers you guys produce while interacting with this rich literary tradition. Good luck!